I am Frank Clement, Judge of the Court of Appeals of Tennessee and a trustee of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Today is December the 11th, 2015. It is my honor to interview the Honorable William C. Koch, Jr. in a project that is sponsored by the Tennessee Bar Foundation called the Legal History Project, and which is in conjunction with the Tennessee Supreme Court Historical Society. In fact, we are in Nashville, Tennessee, in the Supreme Court room in the Supreme Court building in Nashville. Good afternoon, Dean Koch. We're pleased to have you be a part of this historical project. Let's start, if you would, by telling us your name and date of birth.
My name is Bill Koch, and I was born on September 12, 1947.
And you are perhaps the only justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court who was born and raised in the state of Hawaii. Would you tell us about your family and your experience growing up in Hawaii?
Well, my father's family is originally from Pennsylvania, but my grandfather went out to the Hawaiian Islands in the early 1900s and took my father with him, left the rest of the family at home because my grandmother wouldn't go. And they set up an outpost out in Hawaii and never came back. My youngest aunt, my father's youngest sister, eventually joined them when she turned 18 and could leave home without her mother's permission. But the three of them were out in Hawaii. My father received a territorial appointment to West Point from Governor Dole and went to West Point. He didn't graduate because of the war and met a young Army nurse from New Jersey down in Fort Benning, Georgia. And they had one of these wonderful, written about World War II long-distance romances with letters and cables. And about 1943, my father was on a secret mission back to the mainland. My mother had contracted tuberculosis and was in a sanitarium in Colorado. She went AWOL. They met in Flagstaff, Arizona, got married, got on the train, went to San Diego for about 72 hours. And then he went back to the Pacific and she went back to the sanitarium. And they didn't see each other until the war was over.
What is your mother's name?
My mother's name is Adele Harding Koch.
And you were born and grew up in Hawaii, and you went to elementary school and high school and an academy there. Tell us about that.
Well, I started out in public schools, and school kids in Hawaii don't have to wear shoes until they get to high school, so I didn't end up wearing shoes to school until about the 5th grade. I went to a place called Ina Hina Elementary School. It was in the middle of an old cow pasture near Cocoa Head. My parents finally decided they were going to send me to Punahou, President Obama's school. But I stayed there for 2 years, and then I went over to the Big Island to a small boys' school called Hawaii Preparatory Academy, where me and my 46 classmates spent 6 happy years together from 8th grade to 12th grade.
That is fascinating. Now, as you're nearing graduation from high school, you're obviously interested in going to college. How did you decide where to go, and why did you choose that school?
Well, most of our parents were concerned that we knew how to drink beer and surf, but we didn't know how to wear shoes and use utensils, so they encouraged us all to go to college. And the teachers at our school were primarily recruited from the Northeast. They were all Ivy League educated. They had all taught in boys' prep schools on the East Coast. Our headmaster was the former headmaster of Choate School. So there was a strong pressure for all of us to go to school back east, and that's what most of us ended up doing. It turned out to be a good idea for some of us, not a good idea for others of us. We all experienced our first winter when we went away to college in our freshman year, and I decided to go to Trinity, not in Hartford, Connecticut, not coincidentally because 5 of my high school teachers had been Trinity graduates.
How much contact did you have with the mainland before you left for college?
Well, my father was in various businesses, and so my mother and I would accompany him from time to time on his business trips. He was in wholesale jewelry and different places, so we'd go to San Francisco and Chicago and New York sometimes. But we were, that was primarily a week here, a week there. He'd buy a car and we'd drive back to California and put it on the boat and ship it back to the island. So at the tender age of 5 years old, I can remember distinctly driving west and seeing these big billboards that said, "See the $1 million golden nugget." And as we approached Las Vegas, the only thing I wanted to see was the $1 million golden nugget. I had this vision of this huge piece of gold that was worth $1 million. And much to my chagrin, when we got there, I found out it was a casino that 5-year-olds couldn't go in. So I have still yet to see the $1 million golden nugget.
Describe your experience at Trinity College and how that may have impacted your future interests.
Well, I went to Trinity with all intents of going to medical school, and that proved to be a very bad choice because I was not wired for organic chemistry, physics, calculus, and all the courses you have to take to get into medical school. So in addition to taking a pretty tough course load, I experienced, as I said, winter for the first time, and my mother, getting me ready for winter, had bought me a couple of wool sweaters. And of course I got back, and when I experienced the first Connecticut winter, I found an Army-Navy store and bought a real surplus Navy pea coat. So the cold weather was quite a shock. The other thing I found out was that I was now at a school where virtually everybody was smarter than me. So I had to start working a lot harder. And after I decided to change majors after a disastrous first year, one of the members of the faculty took me under his wing, told me I ought to be an English major, so that seemed to be an expedient course to take, so I followed that path. And I would say that the course that I took that might have had the most influence on law school, of all things, was a philosophy of history course, where the professor, rather than giving us a textbook, gave us a sheaf of original papers about the Kearsarge incident and told us that he wanted us to take those original diary entries of the people on the ship, the diary entries, the accounts of the commanders and all that, and write an account of what happened. And that was really fascinating to me, taking raw facts and putting together in a way that told a story. And as it turned out later, that's exactly what lawyers do. But I think it may have been that course that sparked the idea about going to law school. That and going back to Hawaii, if we were good little boys, on Friday night, a doctor in town would invite a group of us over for pie and television. There was only about 3 televisions in Kamuela, Hawaii. And it was called the Eklund Group. And we would go over there on Friday night, and there was a show running on Friday night starring E.G. Marshall called The Defenders. And it's much like what the Law and Order show used to be, although it was all on appeal. And that's something else that always stuck in my mind too, is E.J. Marshall and The Defenders. It lasted about 4 or 5 seasons, but it was a pretty good show. So between the philosophy of history course and television, that's kind of what pointed me in the direction of law school.
That's a fabulous story. Well, you decided to at least consider law school. Where did you apply and why? And then how did you make the final decision to pick Vanderbilt Law School?
Well, the first thing I considered was divinity school. And then I realized that I really did not have a good connection to the Almighty, so that was probably not the thing to do.
Well, in fairness, to this day, you are a leader in the Christ Episcopal Church in Nashville, and you have been teaching a class for many, many years at 7 o'clock in the morning, I believe.
Well, there's a difference between doing that and wearing a collar. So plan B was getting a PhD in English, writing the great American novel, and teaching at an elite college. But unfortunately, everybody else in America was doing that in the 1960s, so the prospects of getting employed and having leather patches on my tweed jackets and smoking my pipe seemed to be remote. So law school came into the picture, and the way that happened, I had finished all my degree requirements by the end of my junior year. So the school basically said, well, you're going to have to show up and do something, but what do you want to do? I said, well, you know, I'd like to read everything that William Faulkner has ever written, fiction, nonfiction, prose, everything, and do an independent study on Faulkner, because I had read Sound and the Fury several times, and the South, as he depicted it, sounded so complex and interesting. I just decided I wanted to read everything he had written about the South. And so when I decided to go to law school, I said, I'm going to end up going back to Hawaii. That's where I'm from. That's where my family is. But I can spend some time in the South, so I'm just going to go to Southern law school. So every law school I applied to was south of the Mason-Dixon line. You know, Virginia, Duke, Vanderbilt, and Tulane. Those were the four.
I understand you had a most unusual experience when you visited Duke Law School. Tell us about that.
I showed up for my interview at Duke in the middle of a race riot, and there were a bunch of outside agitators at Duke that had stirred up the good townspeople of Durham, North Carolina. So when I showed up in my little suit and my wingtip shoes in my cab, they stopped me at the gate of Duke's campus. They were carrying shotguns and asked me what my business was. I told them I was applying to law school. So they accompanied the cab to the front door of the law school, waited until I was finished, and then escorted me in the cab off campus. It moved. Duke's a wonderful school, but that experience kind of moved Duke down to the bottom of the list.
That is a fabulous story, and thank you. I understand you were recruited by a gentleman who worked at Vanderbilt Law School, Johnny Beasley. Tell us about that and the nickname that you and some others wound up with later on.
Well, John Beasley, of course, is quintessential fundraiser for Vanderbilt, but back then he was the assistant dean at Vanderbilt Law School, and he could sell ice to Eskimos if he wanted to. And Beasley showed up in February in Hartford, Connecticut, which is not the sunniest time of year up there. And he has this beatific Southern style. He's a courtly Southern gentleman, and he says, you really ought to think about coming to Nashville. And actually, after I made the tour of the schools that accepted me, I thought Nashville had the most promise, although my first experience with Lower Broad was not the experience that people have today when they see Lower Broadway. But I came to Nashville, and later what I discovered was that between 1968 and about 1974, Beasley had recruited and admitted a very motley crew of students that were very, very different, and that we had all been given the name of Beasley's Bastards. And John actually goes to Christ Church too. I see him often, and I'm proud to count myself as one of Beasley's Bastards.
The time that you came to Vanderbilt and while you were here, that was a difficult time in the United States with Vietnam and other social issues. Did that have any bearing on your studies or activities?
Well, the fact that I was admitted to law school was one of the reasons that enabled me not to go to Southeast Asia. Our class had a number of folks who had come back from Southeast Asia, so we had a mixture of vets and recent college graduates. And it was a difficult time, but Vanderbilt back then was perhaps a little more insulated than it is now. So life at law school went on, I think, in a much more normal, routine way than it might have at other law schools around the country.
What was your experience like in law school, and who were some of the teachers and what were some of the courses that you found most inspirational or that helped shape your future?
Perhaps a better way to say that, what courses did I manage to survive? I still think there's nothing can compare a student for law school. Basically, law school is going to teach you a different way to think. It's going to teach you a different way to speak, and so you have to basically reset your wiring to be able to do what lawyers do. And some of us rebound very quickly. Some of us take a while to get our bearings. I had a class full of high achievers from all over the country, very, very smart folks, very decent, nice people. One of the reasons why I picked Vanderbilt was that they were not as competitive in a cutthroat way as other law schools were. And so we all got along very well, but again, I found myself in the midst of people who were way smarter than I was. So that just means since they can outthink you, you have to try to outwork them. So I spent most of my time with my nose in the book in the library, just trying to keep one step ahead of everyone else. A lot of people got way ahead of me, so I was not successful that way. In terms of the teachers, probably the one that Beasley's bastards would remember more often than not is Paul Hartman. His nickname was the Dutchman. The Dutchman was also the head of the Naval ROTC at Vanderbilt. And he was about 5'1", but if anyone has ever seen The Paper Chase and remember John Houseman's character as the compacts professor, Hartman had him beat. Hartman was tough as nails. But what Hartman would do, we had contracts on Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. We met 4 days a week, and one of them was Saturday. And so he would go around the library on Friday night and look for students who were getting ready for class and invite them to go across the street to either Islands or Lums to drink beer. And so our strategy was, well, if we go lift a few with Professor Hartman, we'll be his pals, and he'd never call on us on Saturday. But inevitably what would happen, he'd come in, he'd have his book in his hand, he'd have his roll, he'd slump the roll on the lectern, and then he'd start moving his hand up and down, his finger up and down the roll, and say, "Why don't you try your hand at this, Mr. Koch?" And so inevitably, if you drank with him, he called on you. So it got harder and harder for him to recruit drinking buddies as the year went on. And he would stand us up, and true to the Socratic method, there'd be occasions where we'd be standing for 35 or 40 minutes, and nothing that we would say would be right. And I can remember several people who I will not name that actually became so frustrated they cried. But Hartman was just trying to teach us what it was like to have to be on your feet and take whatever was coming to you. So I would say I had many wonderful professors, but he is certainly one of the most memorable.
As you neared the end of your legal studies, you were considering your options to commence your legal career. And earlier you said you contemplated always going back to Hawaii, but you started your legal career with the Office of the Attorney General of Tennessee. I understand that some serendipity intervened. Would you tell us about that?
Well, it certainly was serendipitous. It was in February of 1971. I was taking a break at the library outside in the hallway, and a professor who's still in Nashville, Bob Covington, stopped me in the hallway, and he said, "Are you looking for work?" And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm a second-year student at the time." I said, No, I'm not." And he said, "Well, the Attorney General's looking for a law clerk. He's never had a law clerk before. Why don't you go down and talk to the Attorney General about being a law clerk?" And I said, "Well, does it pay?" And he said, "Well, I think there's a little something to it." So I remember the next week I made an appointment. The Attorney General's office was in this very building up on the second floor, and I made an appointment, got the bus at 21st and West End, and came downtown and walked through those doors that I've walked through so many times since. Went up to the second floor. General Pack didn't know me from Adam, but Covington had said I'd be pretty good bet. So he said, I'm just looking for a law clerk. You want to do it? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, it'll pay you $2.50 an hour. Which I said, wow, that's pretty good. So in February of 2001, in my second semester of my second year of law school, I was clerking for the Attorney General's office. And I had no thought of staying in Nashville. As you say, I was going to go back and practice law in Hawaii and pick up the surfing and the beer drinking again. And like many law students, we were told that, it's a good professional credential, good to have on your resume that you clerk for a federal judge. And so I figured, well, I'll go see if I could find me a federal judge that would let me work for him. And the best I could do was finding a U.S. district judge whose office was in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I figured, heck, I can live anywhere for a year or so I'll go to Parkersburg. So I accept that job and discontinue all my other job interviews in the fall of fall of 1971. And I think I'm all set. I'm going to get the clerkship. I'm going to do that. Then I'm going to go back to Hawaii. And I found out in March, about 6 weeks before graduation, that my judge had died suddenly and unexpectedly as a heart attack. So I had no job. And when General Pack found out about that, he said, well, you've been doing pretty good work here. Why don't you come work for me? You'll be the 16th lawyer on our staff. So I said, well, that sounds pretty good. I'll do this for 2 or 3 years, and then I'll go back to Hawaii. So I started in the Attorney General's office.
And the General Pack you're referring to was David Pack, is it?
David M. Pack. He had been the Commissioner of Insurance. He had been, and then he was appointed the Attorney General after George McCandless had been elevated to the Supreme Court.
Describe your experience at the Attorney General's office leading up to and including your role in the decision to accelerate the inauguration of Lamar Alexander by 3 days.
Well, as you might imagine, the Attorney General's office in the early 1970s was far different than the Attorney General's office today. Not better, just different. And all 16 of us basically had to do our own share of the work. There was no such thing as being second chair. I mean, you were just given a file and saying, go do it. So it was a really earn while you learn time down there. And there was a youth movement in the office at the time. I think 5 of us had been out of law school less than 2 years. And so we were just making it up. And sometimes we did all right, sometimes we didn't. One of the first events I can remember, somewhat law-related, was that one of my colleagues in the office at that time was Alex Shipley. And Alex Shipley was the first person who confirmed to Woodward and Bernstein that there had been a dirty tricks campaign going on in Nixon's reelection. And all that hit the New York Times with Alex Shipley's name on the front page of the New York Times saying that he's a member of the Attorney General's office. Well, that was very upsetting to General Pack because General Pack was running for governor in 1974, and he really didn't want his name bandied about in the context of dirty political tricks. We ended up having the national press down here in this building wanting to interview Alex about what he and Donald Segretti might have been up to there. And the Attorney General really frowned on that. He was not happy about it, but there's not much he could do about it. Right after that happened, the Tennessean wrote a story about a Supreme Court decision. And in that story, they quoted an unnamed Assistant Attorney General. And the quote was, "Who knows what goes through the minds of those 5 old men up on the 3rd floor?" Well, the Attorney General rarely had staff meetings, but we had a staff meeting that morning. And so all 15 of us are standing there, and the Attorney General says, "I want whoever said that to have their resignation on my desk in 10 minutes. Well, of course, now everybody's trying to take odds on who it was. it happened to have been me. So I walked back up. My office was up in the attic on the 4th floor back then, and I type up my letter of resignation. The betting is that it's Alex Shipley or Henry Hale. So when I get back, of course, people are looking out their doorway to see who's going toward the Attorney General's office, and when they see me walking down there with an envelope, they're going, "Oh my heavens!" And I walk in the door and hand it to Pack, and Pack looks at me and he says, "You got to be kidding me." I said, "No, it was me." And he says, "I was hoping it was somebody else," because he was looking for an excuse to fire somebody else. And I said, "No, it was me." And he said, "Well, consider yourself, you've got 2 strikes." So I was not fired, but I came very close. General Pack.
I assume at the time you never envisioned that you would be one of those old white men.
Certainly
on the
did
Supreme
not.
Court.
I did not envision that at the time.
I understand also, I'm interrupting you and I want you to continue, but I understand you and some of your colleagues would play some pretty rough tricks on each other, and somebody sent a letter down to you demanding that you go see the general, and tell us what happened.
Well, by the time I finished, I spent about 8 years in the office, and I worked for 5 different attorneys general. And you serve at the attorneys general's pleasure. You're not subject to civil service, so you can get fired for any or no reason. And when General Pack left to run for governor, Milton Rice took his place. And then when General Rice was not reappointed by the court, a lawyer named Ray Ashley from West Tennessee was appointed. Wonderful lawyer, great guy. Well, nobody knew Ray Ashley. So here we are, all our little stallions up in the attic trying to figure out what's going on with this guy, and is he going to keep us or fire us and all that sort of stuff. And General Ashley has his introductory press conference. He says, "I'm going to make a very considered choice about all the personnel in the office, and then everybody go about your business." And so we all went about our business, and about a week later, I'm up in my office in the attic, and I'm opening the afternoon mail, and there's a messenger envelope from the Attorney General, and I open it up, and the letter says that one of the hardest things that I have to do is make personnel decisions, and I just wanted to let you know that while I appreciate the work you've done since you've been in the office, your services are no longer required. So now I'm getting fired for real the second time. Well, I run down the back stairs of the building. I don't wait for the elevator, and I'm going to run into the Attorney General's office to ask for a little due process before I get hung. And waiting in front of the Attorney General's office are my, quote, friends, unquote, who had written that letter and wanted to make sure that they intercepted me before I got into the office, because General Ashley had no idea what was going on. So that's the kind of things we did to each other a lot.
Well, fortunately, that wasn't a valid letter, and you stayed. Tell us more about your experiences in the Attorney General's office.
It was really a great place to work. When I finally left, I had argued over 650 appeals. I had represented all kinds of state agencies and officials. I had represented Governor Blanton and Governor Dunn, although that's another story. That Governor Dunn asked Governor Pack to fire me, but General Pack refused. That was a little political mess. But I worked on cases that young lawyers would never have worked on. And some of them were fascinating, like prosecuting the snake handlers in East Tennessee. I mean, some of them were big deals, like construction cases involving the roof on the mini dome up in Johnson City, liquor license antitrust cases. So, I just got to do a whole lot of very interesting things and loved every minute of it. As I say, it was a real earn while you learn experience, but the office really let those of us who wanted to run as far without a tether as we could, and always gave us a fairly safe landing place. If we slipped and fell, they'd pick us up and let us try again. Near
the end of your tenure with the Attorney General's office, You were instructed to meet with then U.S. Attorney Hal Hartman and others about some concerns that Hal Hartman had learned of through his FBI sources. Tell us about that exceptional experience.
Leading up to that, one of the lawyers that I litigated a number of civil cases with was Lamar Alexander. After he lost the governorship in '74, he went to work with Dearborn and Ewing, and he and Lou Conner and Fred Humbrecht and a number of folks, good civil litigators, filed a number of lawsuits against the state involving procurement issues and things like that, and that was an area that I handled. So I ended up meeting Lamar Alexander in court. That's all I knew him was an adversary. We were on the same side of the case a few times. He ran again in 1978 and won. And again, we were very proud of being nonpartisan in the office, so we didn't give money or put up yard signs or, quote, endorse people. So I hadn't done anything in his campaign. And at that time, the Attorney General was Bill Leach. He was the last Attorney General I worked for. And one day in November, he calls me and he says, has Lamar Alexander called you? And I said, no, why would he? And he said, well, if he calls you, take his call. So a couple of days later, I get a call, and it's Lamar Alexander on the phone. He says, will you come meet with me? And I said, sure. And he had a campaign office out in Green Hills, so I went out to meet him, and he said, I want you to come work for me. And I said, well, I didn't work in your campaign. You know, I'm not a politician. He said, I'm not looking for a politician. I'm looking for a lawyer, and I want you to come work for me. And I said, well, I just really have to think about that because I really like what I'm doing. I'm getting better and better at it, and so I'll just have to think about it. And he said, well, that's fine. You don't have to give me an answer now. And so I went back and consulted with people who have been very helpful over the years, and primarily Bill Willis. And Bill Willis looks at me and says, Koch, if you don't have a good reason, you never tell the governor no. So I called the governor back up and said, yes, I will take your job. So here I am now. I'm going to work for the governor in November in January after he's inaugurated. And so Bill Leach appoints me as the office's liaison to the transition. And it's in that context that Hayes Cooney and I are asked by Leach to meet in a clandestine meeting in mid-January in 1979 with Hal Hartman, who had contacted Governor-elect Alexander about taking the oath early to prevent the early release from prison of other individuals who may have bribed their way out of jail. And so Hayes and I took circuitous routes down to the old Sheraton downtown. It's now the Holiday Inn across the street from the Frisk Center. And Hal and Bill Leach and Hayes Cooney and I met up in that room to hash out finally the legality of whether Governor Alexander could take the oath before the date of the inauguration.
And that process led up to the decision that it was lawful for him to take the oath ahead of time. And when it was decided that that would occur, it was decided that the administration of the oath would take place in this very room, the Supreme Court room in Nashville, Tennessee. And the interested parties, Governor McWhirter, Lieutenant Governor Wilder, Speaker Leach, and others came here, but they wanted the then Chief Justice Joe Henry to administer the oath. And when he was first invited to participate, he had some concerns of the legality, but then you got involved and you kindly persuaded him. Tell us about that.
Let me back up one step to set that up. Deciding that it was legal to take the oath early was made more complex because the Attorney General's office had written one opinion that had said it was perfectly okay. But that opinion got released without the Attorney General knowing had been released. There was not a protocol back at the time where the Attorney General would sign off on all the opinions, so a junior assistant had written an opinion saying, oh yeah, it's okay. When the issue came up for real, General Leach had some misgivings about that. As a matter of fact, he and I were up in Washington. He was getting ready to argue a case before the United States Supreme Court, and he was dictating another opinion over the phone back to Hayes Cooney that walked that opinion back, that basically said, well, perhaps it's legal, perhaps it's not. It's a two-handed opinion. So that opinion was floating around, and what all the participants wanted to do was have the Attorney General plant his flag very firmly about whether it was legal or not. Once we were able to do that, though, quite frankly, the complex part was producing the swearing in. Because the first inkling was that the legislative leaders and the constitutional officers told the governor-elect, we're with you, go ahead and do it. And he says, I'm not standing up there by myself. You know, if we're going to do it, we're all going to hang together. We're all going to be in the frame of the picture. And so it took a little bit of negotiating where everybody finally agreed they'd all be in the picture. And then the question became, well, who's going to administer the oath? And if the constitutional officers and the legislative leaders said, well, if we're going to be in the picture, we need to get the Chief Justice in the picture. So Chief Justice Joe Henry is recovering from a heart attack. He's down at Parkway Towers. And, you know, he's called, and we'll go over and talk to him, and he looks at it and he says, I'm just not sure that this is a good idea. And what I finally had to tell him is, I said, you know, Your Honor, it's going to happen whether you give the oath or not. And he says, well, I'll be there.
It's my understanding that you might have also mentioned that there would be several television cameras present.
Well, I told them that we suspected that there was going to be a lot of publicity about this. And so
and I love Justice Henry, and he never wanted to miss out on an opportunity to participate in grand events.
Well, that's true, and I'll tell you, he came over to the office, and he was actually doing some research up in his office on the third floor. He had the volume of the code open to the oath of office, and about that point, Larry Daughtry from the Tennessean comes in to see him. Larry could read upside down, and Larry, standing at the front of his desk, sees what's open and starts figuring out what may be happening. So Larry wants to make sure he has a scoop. And remember now, we don't have cell phones. The only outside communication in this building is a payphone over by the entrance to the library. And so Larry went down there, put in a quarter, dialed the phone to the Tennessean City desk and said, keep this line open and don't let anybody else get on it. I think something's about to happen. And about a half hour later, something did.
Lamar Alexander took the oath of office in this room at approximately 5 or 5:30 one evening. You were in attendance, as was a very prominent Tennessean, Lewis Donaldson. Someone immediately upon the administration of the oath instructed you and Lewis Donaldson to go to the state capitol and secure the governor's office and all important papers, fearing that the pardons that were at issue that had not been signed or delivered might escape. Tell us about that.
When Alexander and his family came to the building, we let them into the basement through the door that you normally enter, the basement garage. And standing in the garage, even before we went upstairs at that point, was Honey Alexander, Lamar, Tom Ingram, Louie, and me. And as we're getting ready to get on the elevator, the question gets asked, what should we do about the Capitol? So Lamar says, as soon as I take the oath, Louie and Koch go over to the Capitol and secure it. Now remember, what's going on outside of this is there's an ongoing federal grand jury convened over corruption in the governor's office. The FBI has already seized records and documents from the governor's lawyer's office. So we knew that there was going to be some need to preserve what was over there. So we have our marching orders. As soon as he takes the oath, we're supposed to go over and secure the Capitol. It happened to be that that night was the first night that Channel 5's remote television truck was operational. And so actually they broadcast Lamar's early swearing in live. Matter of fact, they broke in to Walter Cronkite to do it. And Chris Clark later gave me those tapes, so I've got 48 minutes of the whole episode. And what you'll see on those tapes is that the governor took the oath, turned to Louis, Louis gave a prayer, and then Louis left. I met him out in the hallway, and we went over to the Capitol to secure it. Now, this is now in the neighborhood of 6 o'clock or so. The Capitol's locked up. There's some custodians cleaning up and some other people that are working. And we're banging on the door of the Capitol, and a employee at F&A, who eventually was my deputy commissioner of personnel, Dick Chapman, opens the door and tells the custodians we better let them in. And we just say, we're here to secure the Capitol. Well, now, consider the picture. Louis Donaldson is a fearsome person, but he's 5 foot if he's anything. I'm not much taller than that, and we're over here to secure the Capitol. And so we go down, there's nobody in the governor's office. So we go down to Counsel's office on the ground floor. And the governor's counsel was in the office, and in his office, and he's got stacks of files, and he's working really hard. And Louis essentially announces that we're here to secure the Capitol at the order of the governor, and that this gentleman needs to leave, pack his stuff up and leave. And Bob Lillard, the governor's lawyer, says, by whose authority? And Louis says, well, by the governor's authority. And Lillard says, well, I don't think Governor Blanton has authorized this. And Louis says, well, he's not the governor anymore. And Lillard says, well, I'm going to get Governor Blanton on the phone. And so he tries to get Governor Blanton on the phone, and he can't. And meanwhile, by the way, Bob Lillard's 6'7". Louis is standing in the doorway, and Louis finally says, you must leave, you must pack up your things and leave. And he says, well, I'm going to take all my files with me and leave. And he says, you are not leaving this office with any file. And the upshot of it was that when Judge Lillard left, he had his briefcase, and the only thing in his briefcase was an autographed picture of Ray Blanton. So we secured the Capitol. And then we put in calls to the FBI and said, come on up here with your truck and get all the bankers' boxes of things you want.
You soon became legal advisor to Governor Alexander, and not long after that, Commissioner of Personnel for the state of Tennessee. What are some of your more memorable events or administrative decisions in which you participated or contributed?
Well, as you might surmise, I don't have an HR background. I was a trial lawyer. That's what I did. And after being the governor's legal advisor for 30 whole days, one Saturday, I get a call about 9 o'clock in the morning saying he needs you out at the residence. And I said, what does he need me about? And they said, just come on out. So I come out, and there were 2 spots in the cabinet that hadn't been filled yet, corrections and personnel. And so he comes out, he says, I need to talk to you about filling these vacancies. And I said, sure. And he says, I want you to be the personnel commissioner. And I said, I'm a trial lawyer. I don't do that sort of stuff. And he says, no, I really think you're the right person. When you were in the Attorney General's office, you wrote an opinion that said it was illegal for public employees to unionize and strike. And we've got unions in mental health and in Brushy Mountain, and I need somebody who's going to go in there and decertify those unions, and I think you're the person to do it. And I said, well, I really need to think about that. I had forgotten Bill Willis's advice, unless you have a good reason, you say, yes, Governor. And so he said, well, let me know this afternoon, because I'd like to announce you on Sunday morning. And so, of course, I went home, called Willis, and he reminded me, unless you have a good reason, you tell the governor yes. So I called the governor back and said, I'm grateful for the chance to be the Commissioner of Personnel. And so I became the commissioner of personnel, and on our plate was decertifying the unions in corrections and mental health, which we did. But of the things that I remember over there more than anything else is that one of my first hires as an assistant commissioner was Francis Guess. And Francis was just a MBA Vanderbilt, smart, wonderful guy. And one of the first things we did was draft an affirmative action executive order that the governor ended up, it may have been the first, if not the first, it was the second executive order he signed setting up affirmative action for the executive branch of state government. And we wrote it in a way where, since Lamar's a lawyer too, you put some things in a document, then you negotiate them out. Lamar took everything we wrote, which we were very grateful for, but there were a lot of things in there we figured were going to fall on the cutting room floor, but they didn't. And that executive order got used by several different governors after that, so I'm really proud of that. The other thing that Francis and I did, was that he eventually became Commissioner of General Services, and there was a pressure on back then to have Martin Luther King's birthday become a holiday. And the legislature didn't want anything to do with that. And the argument that they were making, which was correct, was that it cost $5 million to give state employees a day off, and we just don't want to waste $5 million in salaries. So we're trying to figure out what could we do, make that more palatable. Well, back then, state employees got days off for primary election day and general election day, historically, so they could go vote for the people they were supposed to vote for. And so we ended up just saying, let's swap. Let's have Martin Luther King holiday. We'll give up days off on primary and general election day, and it'll be a wash. It won't cost anything. And that's how we got Martin Luther King's birthday.
You have mentioned several times Attorney Bill Willis. Tell us how you and he first met and how significant a lawyer he was during his life.
Again, I'm here in Nashville. I don't know anybody in the Nashville bar. I don't have cousins, uncles, brothers, sisters. I'm just practicing law in the Attorney General's office, and one day I was arguing a case in front of the Tennessee Supreme Court. It was a murder case, and Willis, whose office was just down the street, was waiting to argue his case, and I finished mine and sat down and went back to work. And a couple of days later, I get this call from Bill Willis, who, I know by reputation as being one of the lions of the bar, and he wants to come talk to me and wants me to come talk to him. And so I come over and talk to him, and Al Knight's in the room, his partner, and actually I think at that time John J. Hooker was going in and out of the office, so he was there, and he finally said, I want you to come to work for me. And I've only been out of law school about 2 years, and I just said, I'm really not ready to do that. I'm learning so much, and right now I think I want to stay in the Attorney General's office. But that started a friendship that lasted until the day Bill died, because Bill was an honest broker. He was candid. He was savvy. He was legally smart, but he was politically smart and real world smart. And he was the kind of person, since at this point my father wasn't in a position to give a lot of professional advice, that he was someone I knew I could go to, and he would ask me the right questions. And he would also be the kind of person that would not make decisions for me. He'd set me up to make decisions. And I'm just eternally grateful to Bill Willis for that.
After 2 years of service as Commissioner of Personnel, in 1981, Governor Alexander appointed you counsel to the governor. You served in that position for 3 years. What did that entail? And identify some of your most memorable experiences.
Well, part of the personnel deal was that I would still come to daily staff meetings, so I was still the legal advisor along with Tom Hull, who was the counsel to the governor, and the commissioner of personnel. So I had kind of two portfolios. When Judge Hull was nominated and confirmed to a U.S. District Court seat up in Greenville, the governor said, "Why don't you come on back full-time to the Capitol?" And you know, now I knew, yes, sir. I came right back to the Capitol. And governors use lawyers different ways depending on their predilection. And what my portfolio as counsel to the governor was to run herd not only on the administration's legislation, but on all legislation was in the General Assembly, to decide what we were going to favor, be neutral about, or not favor, to do some lobbying, to act as an independent advisor to cabinet members on legal issues they may be getting into, to be the liaison between the governor and the attorney general. And it was really one of the most fascinating 3 years I had, just being right in the middle of the critical mass where a lot of policies are being made. Now, the thing I'd tell you about my 3 years that I think is unique is that in 1979, as you said, McWhirter, Wilder, Alexander, and the constitutional officers had all faced a common crisis, the early swearing in. And that event built a level of trust between those people that I don't think has ever been replicated. Because here you had Republicans and Democrats taking political risks, taking legal risks to do something they all thought was right. So when I ended up coming back to the Capitol in 1981, of course, Lieutenant Governor Wilder is still the Speaker of the Senate. Speaker McWhirter hadn't been elected governor yet. He's Speaker of the House. And working with those three to fashion legislation and policies that they could sell to their various constituencies was not only a challenge, I mean, it was fun. It was fun to work across the aisle. You know, and they'd get their votes, we'd get our votes, and we'd all kind of meet in the middle and things would happen. So that's one of the main things I remember about working as counsel for Lamar between 81 and 84. Now, there's one other thing I remember, and I'm remiss if I didn't mention this. The governor's deputy press secretary was a very bright young lady named Debbie Patterson. She had been Lamar's campaign press secretary, and so she was one of his image makers in the governor's office, and she's very, very good at what she did. And we would attend staff meetings every day, and it boiled down in simple terms. It would go something like this: she would say, "Lamar, you got to say something about this," and I would say, "No, you don't. As your lawyer, I'm telling you, you don't want to say anything about this." And she'd say, no, we really got to say something about this. And so that's how I met my wife. And
disagreeing with one is a perfect foundation for a long-term marriage.
But I have to tell you, she was right. I mean, one of the lessons I learned in the governor's office is the power of the public's perception of what you or your client is doing, no matter what the legalities of it are. You know, that no comment is just bad. It's just gas on the fire. It's not a good idea. So I learned a great deal, but when people ask me, "You owe Lamar Alexander a lot," you know, they think I'm just talking about my job or appointing me to the Court of Appeals. I owe him my wife, and that is a lot.
In 1983, while serving as counsel to the governor, you authorized a major producer from Hollywood, the producer of the movie Maria, True Story, to film important scenes for the movie in the Capitol and in the courtroom that we're presently in. Before I ask the question, I want to note that this was Fred Thompson's first starring role in a movie, and he was typecast. He portrayed himself because he had been the attorney who represented Marie Regenti, the former chair of the Tennessee Board of Pardons and Paroles, who was fired because she wouldn't participate in some of Governor Blanton's shenanigans. Now back to the question, how did your involvement lead to a significant improvement in the courtroom that we're sitting in?
Well, again, that's bittersweet for me to have to recount that. See, Hayes Cooney and I represented Governor Blanton against Fred Thompson in Rajandi's case. And after Peter Moss wrote the book, and then Dino De Laurentiis decided to make a movie out of it, that this casting call goes out. You know, they're looking for people to be in the movie. And so Fred, I had known Fred through other things, Fred and I are talking on the phone, and he says, I think I'm going to go down and try out, see if I play myself. And I said, well, I'm going to go with you. Maybe I'll play myself. And so we go down there, and of course, the rest was history. I was left on the cutting room floor. Fred goes on to stardom. And so now the movie comes back to town, and I can't even get a bit role in the movie. But they want to film in this room, in the Supreme Court room, and in the building. And so they bring their set decorator in, and they look at the room, and they say, well, it looks like a courtroom. I said, well, of course it does. It's a courtroom. And so, they come out there with they're seeing what all the backgrounds look like, and finally the set dresser says, this just isn't going to do. And, well, what's the problem? Is that the drapes. The drapes are in tatters. The sun has eaten them away, and they're just falling down. It's terrible. We can't use this room. And so the producer says, well, I don't know what we're going to do about that. And as it turned out, we were giving them the room. We weren't charging them any kind of fee to use the premises. And so the producer says, well, we'll make new drapes. We'll hang them, and everything will be fine. And back then, I.C. Thomason was in charge of the physical plan of the building, and Mr. Thomason, wonderful engineer, had been involved in originally building this building. And he found the old receipts for the fabric, for the drapes, from Paris, France. And they called the factory in Paris. They still had the dye lots, and they made exact replicas of the drapes and had them here in time for the shooting. So the drapes that are in the room today are the drapes that were donated by Dino De Laurentiis for the movie. It turned out, though, that they don't give drapes away. And the cost for each window was around $50,000. But we figured that was a pretty good consideration. You get to use the room, we get new drapes.
This is a good time for us to take a break.